they will all hear this call when it comes. And this is yet future. And there is nothing prophetically that stands in the way of all men hearing that call. So in verse 29, Christ says that all who hear that are in the grave, every single man who hears this call, when this hour comes, he says that they will come forth. All will hear his voice who are in the graves, and they will all come forth. Verse 29, John 5, verse 29. And notice what he says. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those that have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. We're in John chapter 5. John chapter 5, verse 29. Jesus says that all, in the hour that is to come, all will hear his voice. Everyone who's in the grave, every single person will hear. And some will be raised to the resurrection of life, and those that have done evil shall be raised to the resurrection of condemnation. If we are going to talk about resurrection, which is what so many people present as the meaning of Easter, when we look at resurrection, we have to look at it from a twofold stance. Those who are righteous and those who are unrighteous. When Jesus says those that have done good to the resurrection of life, he is not talking about those who merited salvation. He is not talking about those whose good deeds brought about his salvation. We know that because in verse 25, he talks about, or in verse 24, he talks about those who hear the word of God. And they will be raised from their spiritual deadness. We all know that salvation is by grace. And by grace, you are saved. We know this from Ephesians 2, verse 8 through 10. So when Christ talks about those who have done good to the resurrection of life, it is talking about those who believed in him. That is what they did that was good. Number one. Number two, those who've done good to the resurrection of life are those who, when they believe, because they believed, they produce good works. Because they believed. We were conformed to the image of Christ when we believed. We were transformed by the renewing of our minds when we believed. And as a result of our belief, since faith without works is dead, when you have belief, belief produces good works. We become trees that were planted by living waters. We are not fig trees that just have leaves and there's no fruit, and therefore cursed by Christ. No, we are trees planted by running water. And when we believe, we produce fruit. Salvation and the works that it produces are given to us together. We are not given salvation and then left to our own to produce fruits. God gave us salvation, and God gave us the fruit that we would produce. In verse 29, those that have done good to the resurrection of life, this is what Christ is talking about. And resurrection is what we look for because it completes our redemption. It is the glorification of our bodies and the reanimation of our glorified bodies with our spirits that we have right now being brought back together, raised again, and to live forevermore in heaven, in those heavenly mansions that the Lord tells us have been prepared for us from before the foundation of the world. The mansions that are in God's house, we are told were made for us before the foundation of the world. And let me explain something to you on this point. There will be no vacant mansions in heaven. God created the exact number of mansions that he prepared for those people whom he has prepared for salvation, whom he has prepared for those heavenly and holy habitations. There will be no vacancies in God's house. Not one mansion will be vacant. Moving on and getting near the end. Christ also says, those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. Christ talks about the resurrection being general. Talks about the resurrection being general. He says that when he comes back, all who are in the graves will hear his voice. And he says who they are. They are those that have done good and those that have done evil. To the first, to the former, they shall have the resurrection unto life. The latter will have the resurrection unto condemnation. Jesus says when he sounds with his voice, all of them will hear and be raised. All people, the righteous and the unrighteous. There is no separation between the righteous resurrection and the unrighteous resurrection. There is no pre-tribulation rapture of just the Christians, and then some thousands of years later, perhaps, there is another separate resurrection. Nothing in this passage says and suggests any such thing. Nothing here. Christ says that in verse 29, he says in verse 28, all who are in the graves will hear his voice. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those that have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. It is a general resurrection. There's nothing in here speaking about a pre-tribulation rapture. There's nothing in here talking about a separation between when the righteous dead are raised and when the unrighteous dead are raised. Nothing to separate these two. It is the general assize. It is a general resurrection when Christ comes back. And he says notice, he says this in verse 28. He says, for the hour is coming.